Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There is a Brexit theme, there is a European theme to just about everything we are doing this morning. And we're going to talk more now about Gibraltar, the part of the Iberian Peninsula that's so British it makes Benidorm look like a matador eating tapas in the Alhambra. The long-standing Spanish desire to get its hands on Gibraltar appeared to get a boost this week when the European Council said that after Brexit, the UK would need to do a deal with Gibraltar with Spain. Fabian Picardo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, has flown in specially to be with us, and good morning.
Good morning, Andy.
The Sunday Times says that you repeatedly lobbied ministers to get the Prime Minister's letter triggering Article 50 to talk about Gibraltar. Did you lobby?
We're working very, very closely indeed with the British government, and there's a joint ministerial council which includes Gibraltar and ministers from DEXEU where we feed in all our issues. We are fully involved in this process, and in doing so, we've taken tactical and strategic decisions with the British government about, inter alia, what should go into the Article 50 letter.
So you've had all of these conversations.
But there's no point having tactical and strategic discussions and then coming and discussing them in public. So what I can tell you is that the Article 50 letter does make reference to Gibraltar, if not explicitly, then tangentially, by cross-referencing to the white paper where the United Kingdom has set out more detail of what it's going to do.
So you had all of these conversations with the British government, who are full today of, lots of talk about the Rock and implacable support, and yet you couldn't get Gibraltar mentioned explicitly in any of the 2,200 words that Theresa May wrote in her letter. You maybe need to be better at lobbying.
You're making an assumption that that was the decision that we made with the British government and that they didn't follow through. And I'm sorry to say, I don't think that's fair. In the same way as I don't think it's fair to say that the position in Spain is reflected on page 19 of El País. Yesterday's front page of ABC newspaper was a table with the EU and Spain in the other and Gibraltar in the middle as they carved it up for themselves. So look, I think we need to look beyond what seems to be on the surface.
Before we look beyond, are you not disappointed that Gibraltar wasn't mentioned?
No, look, let's be clear. Gibraltar is mentioned tangentially by reference to the white paper, as are many other things.
Are you thrilled with that?
As are many other things. Well, I'm not thrilled that we're in the situation in which we are, but look, Gibraltar voted 96% to remain. But we have energetically and enthusiastically decided that we have to support the Prime Minister in this process of making Brexit a success for Britain and for Gibraltar. And therein lies the rub. When we get the deal in Brexit, it must be a deal that applies, of course, to the United Kingdom in respect of future trade. And if there is such a deal, it is only fair, proper and right that it should also apply to Gibraltar.
But in terms of the negotiations, you presumably want Gibraltar off the table. You don't want Gibraltar to be part of the Brexit talks, do you?
Well, Gibraltar is not on the table as a chip, but there is a lot to talk about. Oh, certainly not. And anybody who thinks that we are isn't actually realising what this negotiation is going to be about.
Well, anybody who thinks that you are might have read the European Council's draft.
Well, the European Council's draft simply says that Gibraltar is off the table in the context of the discussions of the new trade deal.
And after Brexit, Spain gets a say in your future.
Yes, and that... hang on, that's just the draft at the moment. Let's see what comes back on the 29th of April. But even if it comes back as it is, it's very clear that we're entering a negotiation. And what we are seeing, which has not been seen on the British side, by the way, what we are seeing are the negotiating guidelines, the parameters that will limit the operation of negotiation on the part of the Council. That's how they're going into the negotiation. This is their best case. Let's see what comes out of that. I'm sure that the United Kingdom will be batting for Gibraltar, and I'm sure that the people of Gibraltar know that in the context in which we're dealing, we have an important neighbour to the north with whom we have to be in contact.
You need to get it out of the draft, don't you?
No, it's not about getting it out of the
You're
draft.
You're happy with it remaining in there for the whole of the Brexit?
No. Hang on, Eddie. Let me just try and deal with it this way. This is somebody else's document. It's not our document. If this were in the British document for the negotiations, then I would be very upset and I would ensure it came out.
Say this for the EU. At least they mentioned Gibraltar.
Well, this is what the other side are saying that one of the parties wants in the context of the negotiation. Well, I'm surprised this is all they've put in. They haven't put in anything about the sovereignty of Gibraltar, which is what Spain we know wants. So to a very great extent, this has limited the application of the principle of Gibraltar in the context of what the EU is going to come to the table with, simply by Spain saying, Gibraltar must form part of the exit negotiation, but it cannot form part of the future deal negotiation.
We know how passionate you and almost everybody else in Gibraltar is about remaining British.
And a lot of members of the House of Commons as well.
But can you tell me what would really be so wrong in what I suppose would be the worst case scenario for you? What would be so wrong in terms of your day-to-day life if sovereignty with Spain was shared?
Well, it would strip us of who we are. It's that
You'd
simple.
still be British if it was shared.
No, hang on a minute. Gibraltar would not be British if sovereignty was shared with Spain. And for what price would you sell Cornwall to the French? And why shouldn't Cornwall perhaps be French because it's closer to the French
Just tell me how awful your life would be if Spain shared sovereignty.
It would be absolutely awful because
What would make it so awful?
our home would have been handed over shared and therefore in part handed over to a party who has no claim to title.
You can't tell me apart from that feeling in your gut, which I take, which of course is important.
But why should we, Eddie?
But in your day-to-day lives, you probably carry on as before, perhaps even better.
But our day-to-day lives would not be the lives that we live today, because we would be living, in effect, in what is partly somebody else's land. And that would be massively unfair to the people of Gibraltar. The United Kingdom goes to war over the principle of consent around the world, and the people of Gibraltar have expressed their views as to what they think the sovereignty of Gibraltar should be democratically and freely.
Are you absolutely confident that this government, which didn't mention you in 2,200 words, after intensive Brexit negotiations, perhaps on the brink of a brilliant and historic deal about the future of the United Kingdom, wouldn't, if it had to, throw Gibraltar under the bus for that deal?
I am absolutely confident that in crafting those 2,200 words, we worked closely with the British government, we made tactical and strategic decisions, and when the time comes, we'll be making the right tactical and strategic decisions with the Prime Minister leading us in those negotiations, which will be in the interest of the people of Gibraltar and in pursuit of their wishes.
Chief Minister, thank you. Thank you for flying in all this way.
For the people of Gibraltar, Clause 22 of the EU's draft negotiating guidelines came as something of a shock. The guidelines propose that the government in Spain be given a veto over any future trade deal between Britain and the EU as it applies to the British territory. The UK government reacted strongly, saying Gibraltar will not be bargained away in the Brexit talks. Here's the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, speaking earlier on the BBC.
We're going to look after Gibraltar. Gibraltar's going to be protected all the way, because the sovereignty of Gibraltar cannot be changed without the agreement of the people of Gibraltar. They've made it very clear they do not want to live under Spanish rule, and it's interesting, I think, in the draft guidelines from the EU that Spain is not saying that the whole thing is subject to the transfer of sovereignty.
Michael Fallon speaking earlier. Steve, is this a Spanish power grab or much ado about nothing?
Well, it could turn out to be both. I mean, clearly what is happening with this negotiation, and will happen again and again, in my view, is that at different points, individual countries can start sort of playing various bargaining cards. You know, they will say, if you want a deal, you've got to deliver this, United Kingdom. Spain's doing it early on with this. It might turn out to be nothing at all. But it is an early example of how, after Article 50 is triggered, the dynamic changes. And we're going to hear from individual countries at times what they want from the UK as much as a coordinated European response, because at certain points any country can veto this, can't they? So it gives them much more power than I think we've clocked so far.
Yeah, Mr. Tusk, the head of the Council of Europe, he went out of his way to say that Britain mustn't deal bilaterally, mustn't deal with individual countries, it's got to deal with the EU as a bloc. Was it a bit of mischief making to add this bit in about Spain?
Because those two things don't really tally, do they? He allowed himself to be lobbied and to put this into their response. I think on our part, we, when I say we, I mean the Foreign Office and Number 10 somewhat dropped the ball here. I think that by excluding Gibraltar from the letter of Article 50, they gave an opportunity to the Spanish to steal the narrative. I tell you why I think this is important. Presentationally, things looked like they were going quite well for Theresa May when she handed over the letter on Article 50 for all of a few hours, and then suddenly you have this incredible symbolism of Gibraltar. I think for Brexiteers, the idea that there could be some kind of diminishment or failure in relation to Gibraltar would be a very symbolic illustration of things not going entirely to plan. Forget the detail of it, it just doesn't look great.
Gibraltar got several mentions in the government white paper, but it didn't get a mention in the Article 50 notification. Do you think the British government didn't see this coming?
To be all honest, I don't think it would make a single slight bit of difference. I think Theresa May could have an entire chapter in her, entire 500 words in her letter to Donald Tusk, and the Spanish and the EU would have still tried this on. For me, it was as much a point of symbolism that Tusk brought this up than it was for any actual real power grab. It was a very good point to make. You need to now know, Britain, you're not in our club anymore, therefore we will not have your interests at heart. EU Commission officials, after the Tusk press conference on Friday morning, then went on to talk about this. Well, it's a territorial dispute. Britain will no longer remember, therefore we side with Marr. It's not a territorial dispute. Gibraltar is British, as we would like to continue to think. So it's very much a shot across our bows. Whether it comes to pass, whether it adds up to very much, is really still yet to be seen.
I fear we're going to be chasing hares like this for the next 2 years.
Yeah, there will be many other examples of this as various countries say, oh, we might want a bit of this or a bit of that. And they are greatly empowered by this whole process. And Britain hasn't really got... Britain has just got to wait and hear what their interpretation of Brexit is. Obviously, they will negotiate, and we will negotiate accordingly. But I have some sympathy about this letter, the Article 50 letter. They agonised over it. They had so much to get right in terms of balance and tone. It would have been absurd. They start mentioning Skegness and everything else. And I can understand why this particular... And why not?
What did they ever do?
Why this particular issue was omitted from that letter. But it is a real example of how the dynamic now changes with Article 50.
And by the way, the Spanish royals are due to come here in a couple of months' time. That could be an interesting visit.
Well, I'm sure that'll
We'll welcome
produce
them with open
an era
arms,
of
I'm
good
sure.
feelings will break out. So after an historic week, the UK is now very much in the EU departure lounge. But will it be a smooth journey to the exit door, or can we expect a bit of turbulence? Here's Ellie Price.
Are you taking back control, Prime Minister?
Big days in politics usually involve people shouting and the Prime Minister getting in a car. It's only a few hundred metres from Downing Street to Parliament. But this short journey is the start of a much longer one, and we don't know exactly where we'll all end up.
This is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back.
Moments earlier, this Dear Don letter was delivered by Britain's ambassador in Brussels to the EU Council President, Donald Tusk. He seemed genuinely upset to have been jilted.
We already miss you. Thank you and goodbye.
Back in Westminster, hacks from around the world were trying to work out what it all meant for the coming negotiations. So, here it is, a copy of the 6-page letter to Donald Tusk from Theresa May. The letter reaffirmed the PM's proposal to have talks on the exit deal and a future trade deal at the same time. It also mentioned the word security 11 times and stated a failure to reach agreement would mean cooperation in the fight against crime and terrorism would be weakened. Later, our very own Andrew got to ask her what would happen if Britain left the European policing agency, Europol.
Well, we wouldn't be able to access information in the same way as we would as a member. So it's important, I think, that we're able to negotiate a continuing relationship that enables us to work together in the way that we have.
That night, the Brexiteers were happy. The process was finally underway.
Yes, we didn't have a Mad Hatter, but now we do.
Down the street, even the Remainers, having a Mad Hatter's tea party, seemed to be taking it well. I'm not sure that's actually Boris, though. Oh, hello. It had been a busy day. The next morning, the papers suggested Theresa May would use security as a bargaining tool and threatened to withdraw the UK's cooperation in this area if no deal was struck. Downing Street denied it, as did the Brexit Secretary.
Her words were, we can both cope, but we will both be worse off. And that seems to me a statement of fact. It's not a threat, it's a statement of fact.
David Davis had other business that morning, introducing the Great Repeal Bill, outlining his plans to transfer all EU law into British law to change later, a sort of cut and paste job. It's not without its critics, but the Brexit Secretary said, among other benefits, it would make trade talks easier between member states.
As we exit the EU and seek a new deep and special partnership with the European Union, we'll be doing so from a position where we have the same standards and rules. But it will also ensure that we deliver on our promise to end the supremacy of European Union law in the UK as we exit.
There was, though, a small issue with the name. The government hit an early hurdle with the Great Repeal Bill. Parliamentary draftsmen said they weren't allowed to use the word great, so it's just the Repeal Bill. Great. So far, it had been a tale of two cities, Westminster and Brussels. By Friday, there was another, Valletta in Malta, where EU leaders were having a meeting. And President Tusk, yes, him again, set out draft guidelines for the EU Brexit strategy.
Once and only once we have achieved sufficient progress on the withdrawal, can we discuss the framework for our future relationship. Starting parallel talks on all issues at the same time, as suggested by some in the UK, will not happen. The EU27 does not and will not pursue a punitive approach. Brexit in itself is already punitive enough.
The pressure on Theresa May to get the Brexit process going has now gone, and the stage is being set elsewhere for the showdown with Brussels to properly begin. But face-to-face discussions are not likely to happen before May or even early June. No one is celebrating just yet.
We're joined now from Kent by the former Conservative leader, Michael Howard. Michael Howard, the EU says it won't talk about any future relationship with the UK until there's been what it calls sufficient progress on agreeing the divorce bill. Should the UK agree to this phased approach?
Well, I think you can make too much about the sequence and the timing of the negotiations. I assume that it will be a case of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so any agreements that might be reached on things that are talked about early on will be very provisional. And so I think you can make a big deal about the timing and the sequence when I don't think it really matters as much as all that.
Don't people have a right in this country to be surprised by all this talk of a massive multi-billion-pound divorce settlement? I mean, I don't remember either side making much of this in the referendum, do you?
No, and indeed a select committee of the House of Lords recently reported and said that there was no legal basis for any exit fee. So we will have to see how the negotiations go. I think some of the figures that have been cited so far are wildly out of kilter and wildly unrealistic. But we'll have to see what happens in the negotiations. As one of your panel commented earlier, there are going to be lots of hares to pursue over the next couple of years, and we shouldn't get too excited about any of them.
But do you think it likely, would you accept that we do make, it may not be as anything like the figures that Brussels is kicking around at the moment of 50, 60 billion euros, but do you accept we will have to make a one-off multi-billion-pound settlement?
If we get everything else we want, if we get a really good trade deal and access for the City of London and so on, then speaking for myself, I would be prepared to make a modest payment. But it all depends on the deal we get.
What would modest be?
Oh, I can't give you a figure, Andrew. We're right at the start of these negotiations, and I don't think that will be agreed until near the end.
The EU says that if there is a transition period of several years after the negotiations, and there's more talk of that, the UK must remain subject to the free movement of peoples and the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Would that be acceptable to you?
Well, it depends on the nature of the transitional agreement. I think we're getting well ahead of ourselves here, because you can't, I think, form any judgment as to whether there should be a transitional stage until you know what the final deal is. And if there is to be a final deal, and then you know how long it might take to implement that deal. So that's something I think that it's really rather futile to talk about at this stage. It may become relevant depending on the nature of the deal, and that's the proper time to talk about it and decide what the answer to the questions you pose might be.
Except that the EU has laid this out in its negotiating mandate, and I think it's reasonable to ask people like yourself, should we accept that?
And it's reasonable for me to say they're going to raise all sorts of things in their negotiating mandate, and we don't need to form a view on all of them at this stage.
Well, let me try another one then. Because the EU says that if they do agree what you've just called a comprehensive free trade deal, then we'd have to accept EU constraints on state aid and taxes like VAT and corporation tax. Would you accept that?
Well, I'm not sure quite what they have in mind on that. We will be an independent country when we leave, and we'll make our own decisions about those matters.
Not according to the negotiating mandate.
Sure, but you know, as I've said, they'll put all sorts of things in their negotiating guidelines. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with them, but no doubt that's something that we can discuss in the context of a free trade agreement. If we get a free trade agreement, that's very important for them as well as for us, and we can talk about some of the things that you've just mentioned.
Well, could the Tories really face the voters in 2020 without having repatriated full control of migration, taxes and the law?
I think we will have repatriated all three of those things by the time of the next general election.
How high would you rate the chances of no deal? And does that prospect worry you?
I think the chances are we will get a deal, and I think the chances are we will get a good deal, because that's in the interests of both sides of this negotiation. But it is not the end of the world if we don't get a deal. Most trade in the world is carried out under WTO rules, and we would be perfectly okay if we traded with the European Union, as with everybody else, under WTO rules. But it's better to get a deal, and I think we will get a deal because, as I say, it's in the interests of both.
Let me ask you about Gibraltar. You've campaigned in Gibraltar when a sovereignty issue came up under the Blair government. The EU says that Spain will have a veto on whether any Brexit deal, the free trade deal you're talking about, should apply to the ROC. How should the British government respond to that?
As it has responded by making it absolutely clear that we will stand by Gibraltar. 35 years ago this week, Andrew, another woman Prime Minister sent a task force halfway across the world to protect another small group of British people against another Spanish-speaking country. And I'm absolutely clear that our current woman Prime Minister will show the same resolve in relation to Gibraltar as her predecessor did. 35 years ago this week, another woman Prime Minister sent a task force halfway across the world to defend the freedom of another small group of British people against another Spanish-speaking country. And I'm absolutely certain that our current Prime Minister will show the same resolve in standing by the people of Gibraltar. But I do think it's a remarkable coincidence that it was 35 years ago this week that another woman Prime Minister sent a task force halfway across the world to protect another small group of British people against another Spanish-speaking country. I think it was ill-advised of the European Union to insert that reference to Gibraltar in their draft guidelines. And since they've done it, I can see no harm in reminding them what sort of people we are.
But the logical end of what you're saying is we should go to war with Spain if necessary.
No, what I'm saying is that the Prime Minister, our current Prime Minister, should, and I'm sure will, show the same resolve in looking after the interests of Gibraltar as Margaret Thatcher did looking after the interests of the Falkland Islanders.
Even if you're not advocating war as such, your comments are rather inflammatory and could actually hinder EU negotiations in future.
No, I don't think so. I'm simply drawing attention to a remarkable coincidence and a remarkable anniversary that we should remember this week. It's the European Union that have started all this by making this reference to Gibraltar in their draft guidelines.
Yes, Mr. Hart, but this is not about Spain invading Gibraltar. It's not even about sovereignty. It is about Spain having a veto over whether any free trade deal that the UK makes with the EU should also apply to Gibraltar. Now, how on that issue should the British government respond?
The British government should show resolve. It's not in the interests of Spain, really, to interfere with free trade with Gibraltar. 10,000 people who live in Spain work in Gibraltar. That's a very important Spanish interest. So I'm very confident that in the end we will be able to look after all the interests of Gibraltar, including free trade.
Michael Howard, thank you for joining us from Kent this morning.